Hello, today I'm going to show you how to paint this watercolor giraffe step by step. And in your kit, you will see that you have a palette of watercolor paints, some watercolor paper, which I've already traced the design onto, and a template for you to trace. And to trace this template, you can either hold it up to the window and use the window as a light box, or you can scribble with graphite pencil on the back and then lay it on top and trace it, and it will transfer it. Or you can also go ahead and get carbon paper, graphite transfer paper that can be found at Michael's. And you will also get a variety of different sizes of brushes. So the first thing you want to do is grab your largest flat brush, and we're going to do a wash for the blue sky in the background. And when you do watercolor paintings, you always start with the background first, and you usually start with a wash, which is just where you add a ton of water to your paint so that it's really light, and you're just laying down a base layer. So because our giraffe is going to be light yellow as a base, we're going to not cover the whole thing with blue. So you want to use the edge of your brush and just trace along that outside first as you're going, but otherwise you want to try to brush across your paper going in mostly the same direction. And so you see I have a lot of water in my paint so that it's not too dark, because this is just the base layer. And with watercolor, you always want to work from light to dark, because you can always build the colors darker, but once you've laid down a really dark color, you can't very easily remove it or lighten it up. So you want to be careful. You see, I'm just using the edge of my brush to trace along this outline. And don't worry if you get a little bit of blue inside your design. When we go ahead and add the other colors, you'll be able to kind of disguise it and cover it over. So it doesn't have to be perfect. And as I'm painting, I'm continuing to add water to my blue to keep it watered down. And if you by chance do accidentally get some blue on your paper that's way too dark to start with, you can always just get some plain water and just brush it over it and blend it right on your paper and lighten it up. So I'm just continuing going downward, just brushing across my paper in all the same direction. And then once we have that base filled in, then you're going to grab your round brush. And round brushes are really good for adding texture. And we're going to grab that same blue and layer right over, making some cloudy shapes, just using a circular motion with our brush. And so you can see that what's nice about watercolor is that you can create different values even just by layering the same exact color over top of each other. So I'm using that same blue that I watered down for my wash, and I'm just going over top here and there in a circular motion, and this is giving me the cloud-like designs, and this just makes the sky in the background a little more interesting and just adds some variety. And you can always get just some plain water and wet your brush and just tap off the extra on the paper towel and make some circular motions with the water along the edge of your clouds if any of them have too hard of edges, because you want your clouds to look really light and fluffy. So if you see any hard edges, you can go ahead and blend that using the same motion with just your damp brush. So once you have your texture in the background how you want it, then we're going to let this dry. With watercolor paints, if two colors that are wet touch each other, then they'll bleed together. And so sometimes you don't want that. So for our giraffe, we don't want the blue bleeding into our giraffe. So we're gonna go ahead and let it dry for a little bit. And if you're at home and you have access to a blow dryer, you can always blow dry your painting and hurry this process along. So now that the background is dry, we're going to start filling in our giraffe in stages, starting with the base layer of yellow. So next we're going to grab our medium-sized flat brush, and we're using a flat brush to fill in the base wash for the giraffe. And we're using a flat brush for the wash, again, because this will give us really smooth coverage without a lot of unevenness or texture. And the reason I switched to a little bit of a smaller brush is so that when we're filling in these details up here and this thinner area that we have as opposed to the background, that way we won't go all outside the lines. So when you're painting with watercolors, really the size brush that you use is determined by what size area you have to fill in. So since this is a wash, I'm adding a lot of water to my yellow. This is just going to be our base color. And then I'm going ahead and I'm following the shape of the giraffe. And I'm just brushing up and down with that yellow, kind of similar to what we did with the background, where you're just making sure that you go all in the same direction. I'm going ahead and I'm going around the eyes because we don't want yellow in the eyes, but other than that, you can go ahead and fill everything in for the entire body of the giraffe.
Allise, how do you know that you have enough water in the paint?
There's enough water in the paint if it isn't going in too dark and if it's flowing really nice. When you don't put enough water, it'll get stuck in the texture of the paper and you'll end up with white spots in between your brush strokes. So if that starts happening and if you're dragging your brush across your paper and you see that the paint just isn't moving, that means you need a little more water.
That makes sense. Is it possible to have too much water?
Yes, definitely. How you know if you've added a little bit too much at once is if you notice that you have big pools forming on your paper, kind of like little lakes, then you know you have too much, but you can always blot it with the paper towel. And if you have a tendency to keep adding too much water accidentally, if you're just a little bit heavier with the water, then you can always get your color and then tap off a little bit of the extra on your paper towel before you actually put it on the paper. And that helps a lot of the time. So now we have our base for our giraffe done, and we're gonna hold off on adding any more color to the giraffe for now. And we're going to add the leaves in the background and some that are overlapping with the giraffe while we're letting that dry. So because we want that leafy texture, I'm going to use my round brush again. And I'm going to blend two different colors together, a green and a yellow. So we're going to go ahead first and add a little bit of water to some dark green. And while you're working on your picture that you see, you have a bunch of different shades of green, so you could use whatever shade that you like the best. And since this isn't a wash, we want it to be a little bit darker. This is one of our main objects. I'm just adding a little bit of water, and you'll see the color comes out a lot bolder. And now what I'm doing is I'm doing a technique called stippling, which is where you just stamp up and down with your brush. And this creates that leafy texture so that it looks like there's some bushes or some sort of plant behind and in front of the giraffe. And while you're doing this, you can really make it in any shape you want. You just want to make sure it's uneven. So you want to have little tendrils kind of poking in and out, and you want it to be really jagged on the edge because that's going to look the most natural, like it's an actual plant. And already by now, our giraffe is dry enough that we can even add some of the plants over here that are overlapping, and it's not going to bleed or anything like that. The watercolor paints actually dry pretty quick.
Is there a trick to knowing when it's dry enough, Allise, or is it just kind of a guess?
What you can do when you look at it, if your paper isn't shiny anymore, that tells you that it's dry, and you can also just kind of tap it with your finger and check. So then next I'm rinsing off my round brush and I'm grabbing some yellow, only this time I'm only adding a little bit of water again, so it's the same yellow we used for the base wash of the Giraffe, but I'm adding a lot less water so that the yellow will come out brighter and not as washed out. And then I'm going ahead and I'm doing the same stippling technique right over top in the yellow. And it's okay if our green is still a little bit wet because we actually want these colors to blend together. So that helps to go ahead and put that yellow over when the green is still wet.
I remember learning how to do this stippling when I took your class, and it was always good for me to practice on a separate piece of paper first because I tended to be a little heavy-handed with the push of my brush.
Yes, definitely. And having another piece of paper next to you to test things out is also helpful when you're working with your colors, because sometimes the colors they appear in the palette come out a little different depending how much or how little water you add. So that way you can check and make sure that your color is coming out the value that you want and it isn't too dark or too light.
So can you just use any kind of paper for watercolor, Allise, or does it have to be special?
You want to make sure you're using watercolor paper, because if you just use regular paper, it won't hold up to being wet and it could tear or get all wrinkled and you'll have a really hard time. So you want to make sure that when you go to the store to look for paper, it actually says that it's watercolor paper. All right, now that we've added the yellow over, we're done with our plants for now. So next what we're going to do is start adding the details to our actual giraffe now that we have the background elements all finished. And so we're going to go in first with some of this rusty orange-brown color over top to add some dimension to the face. And then last, we're going to go with some dark brown. And we'll also use some gray and black to add detail to the eyes. So what I'm going to do first is I'm going to go ahead and use this rust-colored kind of orange light brown. And I'm using my round brush because we're working with rounded shapes for the face. And I'm going to add a decent amount of water to it because you don't want it to be too dark, because our darkest area on the face is going to be when we add the richer brown. So I'm adding kind of a medium amount of water to it, not so much that it's a wash, but not too little where it's really dark. And then I'm going ahead and I'm just filling in the bottom of the face right here. And I'm using the tip of my brush to trace along the edge. And by just touching the paper with the tip of the brush, this gives me more control as I'm filling it in so that I don't go outside the lines. And if you do go outside a little bit, just blot it really quick with the paper towel, and if you act quick enough, you can pick it right back up. So I'm filling in this rounded area down here first, and kind of coming to a little point in the center between the eyes, and then I'm bringing a line up that's going to end in another rounded shape towards the center of the top of the head. So we kind of have a little gourd shape here going on. And that's where giraffes naturally have a little darker area on their face. And they're also a little bit darker near the top here and also on their ears. So I'm going ahead and I'm just stroking downward, leaving an uneven edge. I'm just adding a little bit of that rusty orange color. And I'm leaving this uneven edge here that I've made with the tip of my brush because that's going to make it look like hair. So it gives a realistic texture for the fur that would be on the giraffe. And I'm also going ahead and I'm filling in the ears with this color as well. And with watercolors, since they're transparent, you're always still going to see the first color you laid down. So you can use this as a way to mix your colors. So you can see, even though we're putting this rust color over, you can still see the yellow showing through a little bit. So that's something to keep in mind while you're painting. So then I'm gonna go ahead and take some more of this color and just make an edge along the side of the head where it meets the neck, where there would be a little bit of shadow. And so I'm just making this line first, and we have this really hard edge. So then I'm rinsing off my brush and tapping off the extra water. And I'm just going along that edge with the damp brush, and you can see how it blends it out. So then we have a nice soft edge where it goes gradually from the rust color to the yellow.
So again, you just dipped your brush in water and tapped the extra water off?
Yeah.
So that you have just a little bit dampness on there to get that blend.
Yes, and I'm going to do the same thing around the eyes. So I'm outlining the eyes in this rust color. When we just do it like that, it looks kind of funny, like our giraffe has eyeliner on. But when I just get the brush a little bit damp and get off the extra water so it's not dripping, and then run along the edge and blend it out, now it looks more like a shadow. And so that's all the rust color that we're going to put down for now. Okay. So next now I'm going to be using the same brush to start, and I'm going to add in some of the darker shadows that I have on the face and the ears with this darker brown. And so I'm just using that same brush to add, again, a medium amount of water to that dark brown. We want it to flow really nice and blend, but we don't want it to be too light. And our orange is still a little bit damp, but that's okay because we want the orange and brown for this step to blend. So I'm going to go ahead and use the tip of my brush, and I'm going to trace along the line that shows the inside of the ear. And then I'm going to get the extra color off my brush and just tap off the extra water, and I'm just going to blend. And that way it looks like a shadow, and we have a nice soft edge going from dark to light.
When I come in close on this ear, and it looks like you used a couple different colors in this kind of space in here, it's really just the same color, there's just more water.
Yep, I added, at the very end, I added a little swipe of black just near the center where it'd be really dark, but otherwise it's just the dark brown layered over the rust color, but just with more and less water. That's what's really fun about watercolors, is you can change the color you're using just based on the amount of water that you use.
I also notice when I get close to the giraffe's ear that I can see where you kind of moved into the blue area, and I was worried about that on our picture here, but it actually isn't something that you notice much in the finished picture, is it?
You don't, and that's especially with watercolor, it looks a little bit funny, as you can see as you're watching this, until it's all the way finished. So I tell everyone to be patient and just wait till you're all finished, because you really don't notice any little mistakes once it's all done and there's all the details put in. And also, because you're doing so much layering, like right now the colors look really weird on this giraffe even down here, but it all comes together when it's finished. So I'm using the same brush.
It's hard to be patient, isn't it?
It is. I'm using the same brush, and I'm doing little short strokes because these things on the top of the giraffe's head are always a little bit fuzzy. And so to give that look of the hair and the fact that they are kind of furry on top, I'm adding some brown and just making it uneven by using the very tip of my brush to make those little jagged edges. And then I'm rinsing off my brush and tapping off all the extra water, and I'm just going to draw some of this brown down by, again, streaking lightly with my brush. on each side. So I'm just drawing some of that color down that's already there so that we get a nice gradual transition. And then I'm also going to add some brown now to the center of the face, around the eyes, and also down here near the nostrils. So still using my round brush so that I can use that tip to get really fine detail. I'm going to go ahead and just add some brown where giraffes have a little dark spot near the center of the head. And again, I'm making uneven strokes so that it has the texture that looks like hair. And so I'm laying my color down first, same as what I did up here, and then I'm rinsing it off and just going with a damp brush and making the same sort of motions over top to blend it. And I'm going ahead and I'm just brushing over this until that center is filled in. And I'm leaving those uneven edges. And you can see how using the tip of your brush and drawing it up and down, it gives the look of fur. So now I'm switching brushes really quick to my little detail brush, and that's because I'm going to be filling in the nostrils. And if you use too big a brush for small details like that, you run the risk of getting a big dark spot on your painting that's way larger than you want or not the right shape. So you have a lot more control to just fill in that little area that you've outlined when you use your detail brush. And I'm filling this in pretty dark. I didn't put very much water on my brush, so I'm getting the pure dark brown color. And I'm also going to use the detail brush to outline around the eyes, just to add a little bit more darkness around those eyes. So I'm going to go ahead and just really lightly outline the top and then put another line below it for the eyelid. And I'm going to do that on each side. And with this part, you just want to go really slow. If you just go really slow while you're working and while you're outlining, then it makes it a lot easier. And I'm going to put another dark line underneath. And then I'm rinsing off my brush. And as we've been doing, then I'm just brushing along the edge of that darker color with my damp brush.
And it's just the outer edge, isn't it? So you're leaving kind of the inner
edge
sharp.
Yep, it's just the outer edge where it blends into the rest of the giraffe. I'm just using it to blur that out a little bit so it doesn't look like as much of a hard outline, and that just makes it look a lot more natural. So that's all we need to do for now with the detail brush. So I'm still going to be using that same brown, but I'm switching back to my medium-sized round brush. So now I'm going to add the shadows to the bottom of the face here. So I'm still using my brown, and I'm going to go ahead and make some little arc shapes above the nostrils. And everything we're doing right now is just going to make our giraffe look more three-dimensional, where it looks like it's popping off the page. So we're just adding all these shadows to bring some dimension in. So I'm connecting those two arch shapes, and I'm going out and filling in a little diamond shape right below it, all the way to the bottom of the face. And you see this doesn't look very natural right now. It looks kind of like a funny design we put on here. So what I want to do then is rinse off my brush and tap off the extra water, and just with the damp brush now, I'm going to go ahead and blend all of this out. So I'm just blending and smearing this brown out so that it looks more natural. And this way it doesn't look like an outline or like an odd pattern that's on our giraffe. It just looks like a shadow. And every so often you can rinse your brush out again if you feel like you're getting a little bit too much brown built up. And I'm just going to smear that brown really throughout that whole area. And you'll see that even when you smear it out and spread it with your damp brush, it stays the darkest where you first laid your color down. So it stays darkest right around those arches we made and in that little shape in the center, but now it looks more natural. And I'm going to go ahead even and wet this area where we did our nostrils right above it. I'm going to wet that a little bit just to help it blur out. And there aren't a lot of hard edges on animals or plants or nature forms like that, so we want to make sure we keep blurring our edges. And so now we have all our shadows down, but we're still going to keep using the dark brown. And what we're going to do now is add the spots on our giraffe. And so I'm going to be using a flat brush because the spots on a giraffe are a lot more angular, so this is going to help us get the right shape. So I'm using a medium-sized flat brush because we don't want to use the large one or our spots will end up too big. I'm adding some water to the brown. Sometimes you'll have to add a little bit of water as you're working if time goes by because it could start to evaporate and dry up again a little bit. And I'm going to start on the face, and the face has a lot smaller spots, so I'm going to actually stipple, but with a flat brush this time instead of the round brush. So I'm just adding some spots here and there on the face, just kind of using the little edge of my flat brush, kind of tilting it to the side and angle. And you'll see right now it looks kind of funny, almost like confetti.
But that's interesting because you have that triangular shape because you use that brush, and we can see where that's going to be in the final picture as well. If you had used your round brush, it would look more like our leaves, right?
Yeah. And so you can really get a lot of different shapes. The round brushes are great for rounded forms, basically, and the flat brushes are good for geometric forms. And now I'm going to go with just some plain water, and I'm going to blend right over these and really just tap up and down and kind of smear and smudge these around. And then I'm also going to go with my round brush, and while it's still wet, I'm going to add in some of that rust. Just tapping up and down, kind of along the edge of where we have this center area where we added the rust color originally, and also a little bit under the eyes. And blending some more of this color in just makes it a lot more harmonious and brings everything together. And this you just want to do here and there. You don't want to completely cover up your yellow, just especially near that center. You can add some rust blended in. So now we're going to switch back to our medium-sized flat brush, and we're going to add the spots on the neck, which are very angular shaped. You want to be careful when you're doing this. You don't want to end up with complete perfect squares because although they are geometrically shaped, you still want to have those uneven edges because that's going to make it look more natural, because an actual giraffe wouldn't have perfect squares or rectangles for the spots. So I'm just starting at the top and I'm using the shape of my brush to just make a flat area, but then I'm tilting it and kind of curving around and tapping up and down so that there's some of these jagged edges and making it a little more uneven. So you want to purposely make it uneven as you're filling it in. And spots on a giraffe kind of follow a little bit of a pattern where there's some yellow space in between, but they all kind of fit together like puzzle pieces. So once you added that first one, you can kind of keep just making these little oblong shapes. Just filling in some bigger, some smaller, just kind of filling in the space that you have. And again, because they're not perfectly even in nature, there's really no wrong way to do this. Any shape you make your spots and any arrangement you do it in is going to end up looking fine. There's not a certain way that the spots have to be, and all giraffes would be different.
I know that this is something I struggle with. I tend to get into a groove where I want the pattern to be too even.
And me too. So I have to make a conscious effort to kind of step back and look. And that's something you can do. You can even hold up your paper a little bit every so often and kind of lean back and look at how it's looking and see where you might need to add a little bit more variety. Like down here, I'm adding some more horizontally shaped spots because I see I have a lot of vertical ones. And then when you get down to these leaves, you can just kind of work in between them. So I'm just using the little tip of my brush to kind of go around this leaf I have. Okay, same thing over here for this spot. It is going to go into the leaves a little bit, so I'm just using that little corner of my brush where there's that sharp point. I'm just kind of tapping around it. And that's all you really need to do. You don't need to put too many spots in that area because they're mostly covered up anyway. And so now what I'm going to do is, using that same brown, I'm going to go ahead and add the little hair that runs in a stripe along the back of the giraffe. So I'm using the same brush because this flat brush is going to be really nice for giving us the thin, jagged edge. And so first I'm just going to run along the side of the neck, really slowly and carefully to get that straight line. Just pressing down along that edge. And then from there, I'm going to hold my brush at a 90-degree angle to the paper so that I'm using just that whole edge to get a thin line. And I'm just going to tap up and down at an angle. So we're getting all these sharp angled lines, and I'm just going to keep doing that and keep layering over until it's filled in. So anytime you need a sharp edge or a nice thin line, the flat brushes are really great for that. And then once you have it kind of filled in, then you're all set. So that was pretty easy actually. It looks like this would have taken a lot of work, but you just had to tap up and down a little bit and there you have your hair.
That detail is really nice with such a big brush.
Yes, and actually with watercolor, you can have a similar problem too. You don't want to use too big a brush for a small area, but you don't want to use too small of a brush either. Because with watercolors, if you use a brush that's too small to fill an area in, then it could come out really uneven and you could see a lot of brush strokes. So it's always good to just use, you really want to use the biggest brush that you can without making a mess. And that's something that just takes practice. So now the last part is the eyes. And I've left the eyes for last because there is some black in the eyes, and black can really get overpowering with watercolor. And as you saw as we worked with this, even after watercolor is dried, if you get it wet, it still will move around on the paper. So because black is so dark and can easily bleed into other things, it's always best, if you can, to use black last. So just continuing the idea of working from light to dark. So the first thing I'm going to do is take some gray, and I'm using my round brush again because I'm filling in a rounded shape with the eyes. And the eyes in giraffes are really recessed in, so there's a lot of shadow. So you actually don't see any white when you look at a photo of a giraffe. Their eyes are very dark, so that's why I'm putting this gray base color down first.
It seems like eyes can be the hardest thing to do on an animal, because if you don't get that shading right or the contrast right, they look so flat.
They do, and that's why we're going to just add a little bit of black, but still leave mostly gray, because the gray is going to be our highlight that we see. And so I'm going to let this dry now, but while this is drying, I'm going to go ahead and add a little more shadow to the ears. So I'm going to go ahead and take some of this gray with the same brush, and just near the center of each of the ears, I'm just going to put a streak down the center with that gray. And all this is doing is just adding a little more dimension. And then I'm going to rinse it off and do the same thing we've been doing and run along that edge of the color I just added and blend it out. And this would be a good point where you could go ahead and blow dry if you wanted to, because we don't want to run the risk of the black we had over the eyes bleeding. So we want to let that gray base get completely dry before we put the final details over it. So the last step now is to add our black, which we're going to add to just the center of the ears and also the detail in the eyes. And we're going to use our small detail brush for this last step. So I'm going to take the detail brush and add a little bit of water to the black. You don't want it to be too runny. You want the black to go on fairly dark. So we're just going to add a little bit of water to get it going. And then I'm going to start by just adding a simple streak using the tip of my brush just to the very center of each of the ears. It's just going to really show the impression of how the ears kind of fold together. That just gives it a little more shape. And then I'm also going to use this detail brush to outline the eyes. And so I'm going to make a line along the bottom of that eyelid, and I'm going to make it go out past that a little bit, because if you look at close-up photos of giraffes, they actually have really long eyelashes. It's really interesting. So you can go ahead and take your line here a little bit past where the eye goes.
Who knew that a giraffe had cat eyes?
I know, they're so cute. Then I'm going to go ahead and also add some black near the bottom of the eye on the inside of that bottom eyelid. And then I'm going to wet my brush a little bit with just some water and blend along the inside edge a little bit. And this is just going to give us our shadow where the eyelid would kind of overlap with the eyeball. Or on an animal eye or a human eye, there's always a little bit of shadow where the eyelid overlaps. It's really subtle, you hardly notice it, but it does make a difference.
I think that's where we were saying earlier the eyes can look really flat.
Yeah.
If you look at that contouring.
So then I'm also going to add a little bit of black, just getting some of the extra off on my paper towel so it doesn't go on too heavy, where there's a crease under the eye. So I'm just making a little half circle shape under each of the eyes to show that deep shadow where there's some creases. And then last, I'm just adding the eyeball in the center, which we can just fill in with a solid black, because again, giraffe's eyes are really dark. So we're going to go ahead and make a circle, just filling in the center of that eye. So we just filled in one with a simple circle. And then this other eye is kind of to the side, so there's only going to be a little bit of gray showing along that edge. It's mostly going to be filled in with black because of the angle. We're only seeing part of the eye.
That can be one of the hardest things to get, is one of those, an eye like that, that's when they're both not looking in the same direction, but if you did have them doing the same thing, the face would look flat.
Yeah. And that's something, when you're adding the eye, you can start really small and just kind of test it out and just add a little circle and kind of lean back and see if it looks like it's looking at you. And then once you see that the placement is good, then you can fill the whole eye in. And really, your giraffe can be looking in any direction you want. If you don't want it looking straight at you, it's always actually pretty easy. You could just put a little half circle in each right corner, for example, and have it looking off to the side, so you can make your giraffe looking in whatever direction you want.
That's interesting. So now what if you make a mistake with this dark black, Allise? Is there anything to save you?
What you can do is you can cheat, and if you have some white acrylic paint, you can just cover it over with white and start over. So if you really end up with this dark, just having a mistake and having it all fill in where it ends up entirely black, you can take some white acrylic paint and kind of fudge it and go back over.
Would there ever be a time where you might use a pen or a marker or something to do this, or would it not look the same?
You could actually. If you aren't as comfortable using a brush for this finishing detail, you could always use a black Sharpie marker pen and just draw it on if you feel like you'd have more control that way. And now you've completed your giraffe. Watercolor painting is really fun and relaxing when you just break it down into simple steps. A couple things to remember as you're working are to always work from the background to the objects in the foreground and front, and to work from light to dark. And you also want to make sure that you have enough water in your paint so that it doesn't go on too dark right away and it can flow across the paper. But if you see yourself getting little pools and lakes of water, then just blot it with your paper towel and make sure to tap your brush off before you apply it to the paper. Thank you for painting with me.
Thank you, Allise.